Yena stood in the golden glow of her parents' ballroom, but to them, she was invisible. Clad in a simple waitress apron over a crisp white shirt, she moved through the crowd of elites, serving champagne to people who shared her blood but refused to share her name. The heartbreak of being the help at her own family's gala was a silent weight she carried with quiet, braided dignity. The air turned cold when her father, Mr. Min-young, looked right through her to brag to a billionaire about his only child studying abroad. He treated Yena like a ghost, a stain on his reputation to be erased. But from the shadows, a man in a tailored blue suit watched with a lethal, calculated gaze. Do-hyun, the city's most feared mafia boss, didn't see a waitress. He saw a woman of iron being betrayed by the very people she was protecting. Suddenly, the night shattered into violence. As gunfire erupted, the respectable Min-youngs didn't hesitate. They used Yena as a human shield to save their own skins before scrambling for the exit. Left to die in the crossfire, Yena didn't run. She dove toward a wounded Do-hyun, using her own hands to drag the dangerous stranger to safety. Her parents had forsaken her, but the mafia boss had just found his greatest treasure, and he's coming back for revenge. The chandelier light in the grand ballroom was so bright it made Yena's eyes ache, but she kept her gaze lowered as she adjusted the heavy silver tray on her hip. In this room, surrounded by the scent of expensive lilies and aged scotch, she was a shadow. By day, she was a top-performing student and a hard-working waitress, but by night, at least according to the guest list, she didn't exist. She watched her mother, Mrs. Min-young, glide across the floor in a dress that cost more than Yena's yearly rent. Her mother's laughter was light and musical, a sharp contrast to the cold, rigid woman who had told Yena that morning to use the service entrance so the neighbors wouldn't see her. "More champagne, girl," a voice barked. Yena stepped forward, her white button-up shirt pressed and neat, her black apron tied tightly at her waist. She poured the golden liquid into her father's glass. Mr. Min-young didn't even look at her. He was too busy leaning into a circle of wealthy investors, his silver hair shimmering under the lights. "Your daughter must be so proud of this anniversary," Min-young, one of the men, remarked. "I heard she's a genius. Is she here tonight?" Yena's heart skipped a beat. She stood less than a foot away, the neck of the bottle still hovering over her father's flute. For a fleeting second, she wondered if he would finally reach out, pull her into the circle, and tell them the truth. She wondered if the ghost would finally be given a name. Mr. Min-young laughed, a dry, hollow sound. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his posture radiating a stubborn, icy pride. "My daughter is currently finishing her elite studies in London," he said smoothly, his eyes narrowing as they flicked momentarily toward Yena. Not with love, but with a warning. She's far too busy for these local functions. This girl, he gestured vaguely at Yena's apron with a flick of his fingers. She's just part of the seasonal staff. She's nobody. The investors nodded, instantly losing interest in the waitress. Yena felt the words like a physical blow to her chest. She had spent years working double shifts to fund her own education, refusing to be a burden while they lived in luxury. Yet here she was being erased in front of the very people she had been born to lead. She didn't cry. Instead, she straightened her back, her braids neat and her expression calm. She turned away, moving back toward the kitchen, but she felt a heavy, intense gaze following her. In the corner of the room sat a man in a sharp, tailored blue suit. Unlike her father, he wasn't looking through her. He was looking right at her, as if he could see the fire hidden beneath her simple white shirt. It was Do-hyun, and as their eyes met, Yena realized that while her family had forsaken her, the most dangerous man in the room was watching her every move. The silence of the ballroom shattered so suddenly that for a moment, Yena thought the giant chandelier had simply given up and fallen. But the sound wasn't glass. It was the sharp, rhythmic crack of gunfire. Screams erupted, piercing the air as the elite guests, the same people who had just been laughing and sipping champagne, scrambled like panicked animals. Yena's first instinct was to look for her parents. She saw them near the exit. Her father, Mr. Min-young, grabbed Yena by the shoulder, but not to pull her to safety. With a terrified snarl, he shoved her directly into the path of a lunging gunman to buy himself an extra second to escape. "Move, you useless girl," he hissed, his face twisted in a mask of cowardice before he and her mother vanished through the service doors, leaving her behind as a human shield. Yena hit the floor, the cold marble pressing against her cheek. Nearby, the man in the blue suit, Dohayan, slumped against a mahogany bar. Blood was beginning to soak through his expensive shirt, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The gunmen were closing in, their shadows stretching long across the floor. "Over here," Yena whispered, her voice cracking but determined. She didn't have a weapon, but she knew this building better than anyone. She crawled through the spilled wine and broken glass, reaching Dohayan's side. He looked at her, his intense gaze clouded with pain, yet he seemed shocked that the waitress hadn't run away like the rest. She grabbed his arm, pulling his massive weight, with a strength born of pure survival. "The wine cellar," she breathed. "The door is hidden behind tapestry." As they ducked behind the heavy velvet curtains, the bullets thudded into the wood behind them. Once inside the dim, cool air of the cellar, she eased him down. The wound on his side was deep, and he was losing blood fast. Yena looked around desperately, but there were no medical supplies. Her eyes fell on her own reflection in a wine bottle. Without hesitation, she reached up and unraveled the thick, sturdy braids of her hair. The long, synthetic extensions were strong and flexible. With steady hands, she ripped a piece of her clean white shirt to cover the wound, then used the long, dark braids as a cord. She wound the hair tightly around his torso, knotting it with firm, practiced hand to create a makeshift pressure bandage. Dohayan watched her, his jaw clenched against pain. He looked at the discarded apron on the floor, then at the girl whose hair was now messy and free, her face stained with his blood. He had been forsaken by the world, and she had been forsaken by her blood, but in the darkness of the cellar, she had just become his lifeline. He reached out, his blood-stained fingers brushing her hand. "Why?" he rasped. Yena looked toward the door where her parents had disappeared. "Because I know what it's like to be left for dead," she said quietly, "and I don't leave people behind." The air in the room was too still, and smelled faintly of expensive cedar and antiseptic. When Yena opened her eyes, she didn't see the familiar cracked ceiling of her cramped apartment or the flickering lights of the lounge. Instead, she stared up at a vast, coffered ceiling painted in deep cream and gold. She tried to sit up, but a sharp ache in her shoulder reminded her of the chaos in the ballroom. She looked around the massive suite. It was cold and grand like a museum. High-security cameras blinked with small red eyes from the corners of the room, and the heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight. This was the heart of the lion's den. She knew who lived here. Dohayan wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was a man whose name people whispered in fear. Yena braced herself, expecting the door to burst open with men demanding to know who she really was, or she had been part of the setup. Instead, the door opened slowly, and Dohayan walked in. He had changed into a fresh white shirt, though the bandage Yena had fashioned from her own hair was still visible beneath the thin fabric. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who was deeply puzzled. He stopped at the edge of bed, his intense gaze sweeping over her. "Most people wake up in this house and scream," he said, his voice low and raspy, "or they beg for their lives. You're just sitting there looking at me like I'm a problem you're trying to solve." Yena pulled the silken sheets up to her chest, her expression remaining calm and guarded. "I've spent my whole life being a problem for people, Mr. Dohayan. Fear is a luxury I can't afford." Dohayan pulled a folder from the table and tossed it onto the bed. Inside were photos of her from the gala, not as the daughter of the house, but as the waitress. "My men did some digging. I thought you were a plant, a spy sent by the Min Youngs to get close to me. But then I saw the security footage from the exit." He leaned in closer, his sharp jawline tightening. "Your father pushed you into a gunman's path. Your mother didn't even look back. They disowned you in front of the whole world, and then they left you to die." Yena looked at the photos, her heart stinging, but she didn't let a single tear fall. "They didn't leave me to die," she corrected him quietly. "They left a waitress to die. To them, those are two different things." Dohayan's eyes softened. Just for a second, he was fascinated. He had spent his life surrounded by people who stayed for his money or his power. Yet this girl had stayed when she had nothing, simply because she refused to be like the cowards who raised her. They made a mistake, Do-Hyun whispered, reaching out to touch a stray braid that had fallen over her shoulder. They threw away a diamond because they thought it was glass. But I know the difference. The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains, but the warmth didn't reach Yena's hands. She sat at the small mahogany table in the center of the room, watching as Do-Hyun poured 2 cups of black coffee. He moved with slight stiffness, a reminder of the night before, but his eyes were sharp and full of purpose. He placed a thick, leather-bound folder on the table between them. "Your father is a very ambitious man, Yena," Do-Hyun said, his voice as smooth as silk and just as cold. "But ambition without talent usually leads to debt. Heavy debt." He flipped the folder open, revealing page after page of signed promissory notes and bank transfers. Mr. Min Young didn't just spend his own money to throw that gala. He spent mine. He owes my syndicate over $50 million. Yena felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She knew her father was obsessed with status, but she hadn't realized he had gambled the family's entire future on a lie. "He can't pay that," she whispered, her mind racing. Even if he sold the house and the business, it wouldn't be enough. Do-Hyun leaned back, watching her reaction. "You're right. He can't. Usually, when someone owes me that much and fails to pay, I don't just take their business. I take their lives. I was planning to settle the score last night before the shooting started." He paused, his gaze dropping to the makeshift bandage still sitting on the dresser. "But then a waitress with braids and a spine of steel saved my life. Now, I'm feeling uncharacteristically patient." Yena looked up, her eyes narrowing. "What do you want, Do-Hyun? You didn't bring me here just to show me my father's receipts." "I want a new deal," Do-Hyun stated. "I'm going to freeze your father's debt. I won't touch him, and I won't take his company. In exchange, you stay here. You become my personal assistant. You know the city, you know the people who pretend to be good, and you've proven you can stay calm when the bullets fly." Yena looked at the folder, then at the man across from her. She thought of her parents, how they had used her as a shield and left her in the dark. If she agreed, she would be tied to a mafia boss. But if she refused, her father would be dead by sunset, and she would be back on the streets, hunted by his creditors. "I don't do it for him," Yena said firmly, her voice steady. "If I stay for my own freedom. I want a contract. When the debt is clear, I walk away." Do-Hyun smiled, a rare, genuine expression that didn't quite reach his dangerous eyes. "Deal. From this moment on, you don't belong to the Min Youngs. You belong to the house of Do-Hyun." The transition from the cool, clinical bedroom to the walk-in dressing suite felt like stepping into a different world. Yena stood in the center of the room, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her simple white waitress shirt. Around her, racks of silk, velvet, and lace shimmered under recessed spotlights. 2 stylists hovered nearby, but they didn't move until Do-Hyun gave a short, sharp nod. "The apron stays in the past, Yena," Do-Hyun said, leaning against the doorframe. He had swapped his tactical gear for another perfectly cut suit, this one a deep charcoal that made him look even more imposing. "Tonight, you aren't carrying trays or clearing glasses. You are sitting at my right hand." Yena looked at a mannequin wearing a gown the color of midnight. "I don't belong in clothes like these, Do-Hyun. I'm a student and a waitress. Putting on a dress doesn't change who my parents think I am." Do-Hyun stepped into the room, his presence shrinking the space between them. He reached out, his thumb grazing the fabric of her sleeve. "Your parents think you are a servant because you allowed them to define you. Tonight we change the definition." He turned to the stylists. The navy silk and the diamonds. For the next 2 hours, Yena was draped, tucked, and polished. The practical braids she'd used to save a man's life were unraveled and restyled into a crown of elegant, intricate twists that highlighted the steady strength in her eyes. When she finally stepped out from behind the screen, she barely recognized the woman in the full-length mirror. The dress fit her like a second skin, elegant and powerful, matching the intensity of the man waiting for her. Do-Hyun stood up, his gaze sweeping over her. For the first time, his calculated expression faltered, replaced by something warmer and far more dangerous. He held out a velvet box. Inside lay a diamond necklace that sparkled like frozen fire. As he stepped behind her to fasten the clasp, his cold fingers brushed her neck, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. "There's a high society auction tonight," he whispered near her ear. "The Min Youngs will be there, trying to charm their way out of the hole they dug. They are expecting to see the daughter they discarded." He turned her around to face him, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "Let's show them what happens when a help becomes the master of their fate." Yena looked at her reflection one last time. The guarded girl was still there, but beneath the silk and diamonds, a new fire was burning. She took Do Hyen's offered arm, her hand resting lightly but confidently on his sleeve. She was no longer a ghost at the feast. She was a guest of honor, and she was ready to watch her old world crumble. The following afternoon, Do Hyen's driver dropped Yena off at a secluded, high-end boutique to finish tailoring her gowns. The store was a quiet sanctuary of white marble and hushed whispers, a world away from the grease and noise of the lounge where she used to work. But as Yena stepped into the private fitting room, the heavy velvet curtain swung open before she could reach for it. Standing there was Mrs. Min Young. Her mother looked as elegant as ever in a rigid pearl gray suit, but her eyes were frantic, darting toward the door to see if Yena was alone. "Yena," she whispered, her voice trembling. For a fleeting second, Yena's heart tightened. She waited for the question any mother would ask. "Are you hurt? Did that man hurt you? Why did your father leave you behind?" But the question never came. "You have to help us," Mrs. Min Young said, reaching out to grab Yena's wrists. Her grip was cold and desperate. "Your father is losing everything. The bank froze our accounts this morning because of the debts he owes to that monster you're staying with." Yena pulled her hands back, her expression turning to stone. "The monster you and father threw me at to save yourselves?" Mrs. Min Young winced, but she didn't apologize. She didn't even acknowledge the betrayal. "We did what we had to do to survive. Yena, you've always been resilient. You were always a strong one." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Do Hyen trusts you now. We saw you in his car. He has a ledger, Yena, a black book where he keeps the records of every debt and every illegal deal. If you can find it and bring it to us, your father can use it as leverage. He can wipe the debt clean, and we can be a family again." Yena stared at the woman who had raised her. She looked for a flicker of maternal instinct, a shred of genuine guilt for abandoning her daughter in a hail of bullets. Instead, she saw only an enabler, a woman so addicted to her status and her husband's approval that she was willing to ask her daughter to risk her life again. "You aren't here to save me," Yena said, her voice low and dangerously calm. "You're here to use me as a spy. You want me to steal from the only man who actually offered me a hand when I was bleeding on the floor. It's for the family, Yena," her mother pleaded, her eyes filling with shallow, selfish tears. "I don't have a family," Yena replied, stepping past her toward the exit. "I have a father who uses me as a shield and a mother who treats me like a tool. Go back to your husband. Mother, tell him the help isn't taking orders anymore." As Yena walked out to the waiting car, she didn't look back. The last string of her old life had finally snapped, leaving her with a cold, clear clarity. She wasn't just Do Hyen's assistant. She was the only person in her world who knew what loyalty actually meant. The evening rain drummed a rhythmic beat against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Do Hyen's study, creating a cocoon of silver light and shadow. Yena stepped into the room, no longer wearing the heavy diamonds from the night before, but a soft, simple sweater. In her hands, she carried a small first aid kit. Do Hyen was seated at his desk, the glow of a single lamp highlighting the sharp, exhausted lines of his face. The small cut on his forehead, a souvenir from the night his world and hers collided, was still angry and red. "You should have let the house doctor look at that," Yena said softly, moving toward him. Do Hyen looked up, his intense gaze softening as it landed on her. "I don't trust doctors. They see a patient as a collection of parts. I prefer someone who sees the person." He stayed still as Yena pulled a chair close. She dipped a cotton swab into antiseptic and leaned in. The air between them grew thick and quiet. Up close, his jawline was even sharper, a rugged edge that spoke of a man who had fought for everything he owned. As she gently dabbed the wound, Do-Hyun winced slightly, his hand instinctively reaching out to steady himself on the arm of her chair. His fingers brushed against her waist, a touch that was light but felt like a jolt of electricity. "Why did you do it, Yena?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that vibrated in the small space between them. "You had every reason to run. You could have vanished in the smoke, and no one would have blamed the waitress for saving herself." Yena paused, her hand hovering near his temple. "I didn't think about it. I just saw someone who needed help. In my world, you don't leave people behind, even if they're strangers." Do-Hyun reached up, his hand covering hers, gently pulling it away from his forehead so he could look into her steady, serious eyes. "I've spent my life surrounded by loyal men who would sell my soul for a higher price. I've seen families tear each other apart for a seat at a table." He let out a short, hollow laugh. "But in that ballroom, as the bullets flew and your own father used you as a shield, you didn't flinch. You stayed. In that room full of cowards, you were the only one with soul." Yena felt a lump form in her throat. For years, her parents had told her she was a burden, a shadow, a nothing. Yet here was the most dangerous man in the city, looking at her as if she were the only thing that mattered. "I'm not a hero, Do-Hyun," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Maybe not," he replied, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. "But you're the first person who ever saved me without asking what was in it for them. That makes you more dangerous to me than any bullet." She didn't pull her hand away. In the quiet of the lion's den, the wound on his forehead was small, but the connection growing between them was becoming something much larger. In the days that followed, the quiet of the estate was filled not with the sounds of service, but with the scratching of a pen against paper. Do-Hyun had begun to leave his business ledgers and logistics maps open on the desk, watching silently as Yena's eyes lingered over the complex numbers and supply routes. He had originally hired her for her courage, but he soon realized he had stumbled upon something far more rare, a brilliant, untapped mind. One afternoon, while Do-Hyun was struggling with a disrupted shipping route in the city's northern docks, Yena stood behind him, staring at the map. She didn't speak until he sighed in frustration. "You're looking at the roads," she said softly, her voice steady. "But you should be looking at the kitchens." Do-Hyun turned in his chair, his brow furrowed. "The kitchens?" Yena stepped closer, pointing a slender finger at a cluster of small businesses along the waterfront. "These are the back alley supply routes used by the local vendors. I used to work deliveries for the lounge. If you move your cargo through these service entrances at dawn, you bypass the rival checkpoints entirely. They don't watch the help, Do-Hyun. They only watch the front gates." Do-Hyun stared at the map, then back at her. It was a tactical masterpiece born of a life spent in the shadows of the elite. He realized then that Yena hadn't just been a waitress. She had been a silent observer, learning the heartbeat of the city while everyone else was too busy ignoring her. "Sit down," he commanded, but his voice was thick with respect. He pushed a stack of files toward her, the strategic side of his family business, that usually took men decades to master. For hours, he trained her. He explained the delicate balance of power, the way to read a person's true intentions, and how to spot a trap before it was set. To his amazement, Yena didn't just understand. She anticipated his next move. She saw patterns where others saw chaos. She was a scholar of the streets, refined by the very hardship that was meant to break her. "You spent your whole life being told you were nothing," Do-Hyun whispered as she finished reorganizing his entire distribution network. "But you have the mind of a queen, Yena. Your parents didn't just lose a daughter. They lost the most powerful weapon they could have ever owned." Yena looked down at the maps, a small, confident smile finally touching her lips. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving the storm. She was learning how to command it. She wasn't just a waitress or a ghost anymore. She was becoming the architect of her own future, and Do-Hyun was the only one wise enough to stand by her side as she built it. The sun beat down on the emerald green turf of the elite polo club, where the air smelled of expensive leather and freshly mown grass. Yena walked beside Do-Hyun, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She was dressed in a simple but elegant cream-colored sundress that flowed with every step, her skin glowing under the open sky. For the first time, she wasn't there to serve the drinks. She was there to enjoy the afternoon. However, the peaceful atmosphere was cut short as a group of socialites approached. Leading them was Lisa, a woman whose family had long sought an alliance with Dohyan's syndicate. Lisa looked at Yena with a sharp, calculating gaze, her eyes traveling from Yena's face down to her hands. "Dohyan, darling," Lisa purred, her voice dripping with fake sweetness as she ignored Yena entirely. "I heard you had a new assistant, but I didn't realize you were hiring from the local diners. I recognize that grip." She reached out, snatching Yena's hand before she could pull away, holding it up like a specimen for crowd to see. "Look at these calluses. These aren't the hands of a lady. These are waitress hands, stained by cheap dish soap and heavy trays. How embarrassing for you to bring this to such a prestigious match." The women behind Lisa giggled, hiding their smirks behind silk fans. Yena felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, the old familiar sting of shame threatening to pull her back into the shadows. She looked at her hands that had worked double shifts to pay for books, hands that had saved a man's life when everyone else ran. Before Yena could speak, she felt a cold, powerful presence move beside her. Dohyan didn't pull Yena's hand away. Instead, he took it gently in his own, interlacing his fingers with hers. He turned his gaze toward Lisa, his eyes turning into chips of ice. "You're right, Lisa," Dohyan said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that silenced the entire circle. "These hands have worked. They are the hands of a woman who knows the value of effort, loyalty, and courage. They are hands that didn't tremble when the bullets flew, unlike yours, which only know how to hold a daddy's credit card." Dohyan looked up at the club manager, who had hurried over at the sight of the tension. "Cancel the match," Dohyan commanded, his voice echoing across the lawn, "and revoke Lisa's family membership. I won't have my partner insulted by people whose only talent is breathing expensive air." The crowd gasped as the polo players began to lead their horses off the field, and the music stopped. Lisa's face turned a brilliant shade of red, her mouth hanging open in shock. Dohyan ignored her, turning back to Yena. He raised her hand to his lips, kissing the very calluses Lisa had mocked. "Don't ever hide your hands, Yena," he whispered. "To me, they're the most beautiful thing in this park." As they walked away from the ruined event, Yena realized that with Dohyan by her side, the sting of elite no longer had the power to make her feel small. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a woman the Mafia boss was willing to stop the world for. The fragile piece of the estate was shattered late one evening by the frantic ringing of Yena's personal phone, a number only her parents possessed. When she answered, there was no apology on the other end, only the sound of her mother's hysterical sobbing and harsh, gravelly voice of a stranger. "Your parents have been very foolish, Yena," the voice growled. "They tried to play both sides. They took money from the Dragon Syndicate to spy on Dohyan, and now they can't pay it back." The phone was snatched away, and Yena heard her father's voice, thin and trembling with terror. "Yena, please, you have to tell Dohyan to send his men. Tell him to pay them. We're your parents. You can't just let them kill us." Yena sat on the edge of her bed, the cold night air biting at her skin. She looked at the luxury that surrounded her, the silk sheets, the designer clothes, and the life Dohyan had built for her. Then she thought of the ballroom, the sound of gunfire, and the weight of her father's hands shoving her toward a bullet. Dohyan appeared in the doorway, his silhouette tall and imposing. He didn't need to ask what was happening. His security team had already intercepted the signal. He walked over and took the phone from her hand, pressing it to his ear for a second before silencing it. "They're being held in a warehouse by the docks," Dohyan said, his voice devoid of emotion. "If I send my men, I risk a war. If I don't, they'll be gone by sunrise. The choice is yours, Yena. Do you want to save the people who threw you away?" Yena stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark city. For years, she had been a good daughter. Working until her hands bled to satisfy people who never loved her. She felt a deep, painful tug in her chest, the kidnapped conscience that told her she owed them because of blood. But as she looked at her reflection, she saw the woman who had saved a stranger in a cellar, the woman who had learned to read maps and lead men. "They didn't save me," Yena whispered, her voice steadying. "They left me to die so they could live. They didn't see me as a daughter. They saw me as a shield. Do-Hyen stepped up behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. You don't owe them your life, Yena, but you have to decide if you can live with the silence. Yena closed her eyes, picturing her mother's silent enabling and her father's crossed arms. She realized that saving them would make them love her, and letting them die wouldn't erase the pain. I won't ask you to go to war for them, Yena finally said, turned to face her with eyes that were clear and hard as diamonds. But I want to go there. I want to look them in the eye one last time while they're the ones waiting to be saved. I want them to see exactly who it is they decided was nothing. The drive to the docks was silent, the interior of the black SUV heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. Yena watched the city lights blur into streaks of neon and gray, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Beside her, Do-Hyen sat like a statue carved from shadow, his presence cool and grounding. He wasn't wearing his tailored suit tonight. He was dressed in tactical black, a sidearm holstered at his hip, and a radio humming softly on his chest. We're 2 minutes out, Do-Hyen said, his voice cutting through the quiet. He turned to look at Yena, his eyes searching hers. You don't have to be there for this. My men can handle the Dragon Syndicate. You can stay in the car. Yena shook her head, her jaw set in a line of quiet strength. I need to see it. I need to see the end of their lives. The SUV came to a halt behind a row of rusted shipping containers. Do-Hyen's team moved with ghost-like efficiency, slipping into the shadows of the massive warehouse ahead. Before he stepped out of the vehicle, Do-Hyen reached over and took Yena's hand. His grip was warm and steady, a stark contrast to the cold fear she had lived with for years. I want you to understand something, Yena, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate whisper. I'm not risking my men for the sake of Mr. and Mrs. Min-young. I'm not doing this to save their business or their reputations. To me, they are worth nothing. They are less than the dirt on these docks. He squeezed her hand gently. I am doing this for you, because you asked, and because I will never let anything haunt you again. The raid was swift and loud. The sound of flashbangs echoed off the water, followed by the sharp commands of Do-Hyen's unit. Yena followed at a safe distance, protected by a wall of black-clad guards. When she entered the center of the warehouse, she saw her parents huddled on the floor, tied to mismatched wooden chairs. They were disheveled, their expensive clothes torn and dusty, looking smaller and more pathetic than she had ever imagined. As the light hit them, Mr. Min-young looked up. When he saw Do-Hyen, he began to blubber about his gratitude, but as his eyes landed on Yena, his expression shifted back to one of demand. Yena, untie us. Tell your man to get us out of here immediately. Do you know how cold it is in here? Yena didn't move. She stood perfectly still, looking at the man who had shoved her into gunfire and the mother who had asked her to steal. For the first time, she didn't feel the sting of their rejection. She felt only a profound, hollow pity. She looked at Do-Hyen, who was watching her, waiting for her word. She realized then that the rescue wasn't for her parents' lives. It was for her own freedom. She had proven she was better than them, and now she was finally ready to leave them behind. The damp air of the warehouse felt heavier than ever as the smoke from the raid began to clear. Yena stood in the shadows of a stack of crates, her heart still racing. She had come here to see her parents rescued, hoping that perhaps, in the face of death, they would finally show a flicker of the love she had craved for 20 years. Do-Hyen was occupied across the room, giving orders to his men and securing the perimeter. Seizing the moment of relative quiet, Yena's father, Mr. Min-young, scrambled to his feet. He didn't run to Yena, to hug her. Instead, he lunged toward the captured leader of the Dragon Syndicate, who was being pinned down by one of Do-Hyen's guards. Wait! Listen to me, Mr. Min-young hissed, his voice desperate and thin. He didn't realize Yena was standing just a few feet behind him, hidden by the darkness. You want leverage against Do-Hyen, don't you? You want a way to break him. The rival boss spat on the floor, looking at Mr. Min-young with pure contempt. Your life is worth nothing to me, old man. You're a debt that hasn't been paid. No, you don't understand. Mr. Min-young scrambled closer, his eyes wild. Look at her. Look at Yena. Do-Hyen is obsessed with her. He came all the way here for her. If you take her, He'll give you anything. Forget my debts. Take her as your prize. I'll give her to you. I'll sign whatever papers you need. Just tell your people to let me and my wife walk away. She's a smart girl. She'll serve you better than she served him." Yena felt as if the floor had vanished beneath her. The bitter truth wasn't just that they didn't love her. It was that her father still saw her as a piece of property to be traded for his own skin. He wasn't just a coward. He was a predator who had spent his whole life trying to sell a daughter who had done nothing but try to save him. "Is that all I am to you?" Yena's voice was a low, hollow whisper that cut through her father's frantic bartering. Mr. Minyoung froze. He turned slowly, his face pale and sweat-streaked. He didn't look guilty. He looked annoyed that he had been caught. "Yena, be reasonable," he stammered, trying to straighten his torn suit jacket. "It's a business move. You like powerful men, don't you? This is for the good of the family name." "There is no family," Yena said, her voice growing stronger as the last bit of hope shattered inside her. "There's only you and your greed." Do-hyun appeared beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon, his eyes burning with murderous light as he looked at Mr. Minyoung. He had heard everything. "You just made the worst trade of your life," Do-hyun growled. Yena stepped out of the shadows, her head held high. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply turned her back on the man who had shared her blood, leaving him to face the consequences of a debt he could never repay. She was finally, truly, free. The following week, the air was thick with anticipation as the city's elite gathered at the Grand Palace Hotel. Do-hyun had sent out gold-embossed invitations for a peace treaty gala, a night meant to settle old scores and stabilize the underworld's economy. Among the first to arrive were the Minyoungs. Despite their recent kidnapping and the ruin of their reputation, they walked with their heads high, convinced that Do-hyun was throwing this party to formally welcome them into his inner circle as his future in-laws. Mr. Minyoung adjusted his silk tie, a smug smile playing on his lips. "You see," he whispered to his wife, "Do-hyun realized he can't run this city without our connections. This party is his way of apologizing for how he treated us at the docks. We are the guests of honor tonight." Mrs. Minyoung nodded, smoothing her gown, already imagining the envy of the other socialites. They walked toward the head table, the most prestigious seat in the house, expecting to see their names on the place cards. But as they reached the front of the room, the crowd went silent. The heavy double doors opened, and Do-hyun walked in, looking more powerful than ever in a midnight blue tuxedo. But he wasn't alone. Walking beside him, her hand resting firmly on his arm, was Yena. She looked breathtaking. She wore a gown of shimmering silver that caught every light in the room, her hair styled in a crown of regal, polished coils. There was no trace of the waitress left in her posture. She moved with grace and authority that commanded the room. As the music swelled, Do-hyun didn't lead her to a side table. He led her straight to the center chair at the head of the table, the seat of the master. Mr. Minyoung's face turned a ghostly shade of white. "Yena," he stammered, his voice cracking, "what are you doing in that seat? Move aside. That's for the guest of honor." Do-hyun stepped forward, his eyes cold and sharp. He placed a hand protectively on Yena's shoulder, making it clear to everyone in the room exactly where his loyalty lay. "You are mistaken, Minyoung," Do-hyun said, his voice echoing to the silent hall. "You are not the guest of honor. You are simply guests. Yena is the host. This entire evening, and the peace treaty we are signing, is under her authority." Yena looked at her parents, not with anger, but with a calm, distant strength. She sat at the head of the table, the very position they had spent their lives trying to reach, while they stood below her like common petitioners. The treasure they had forsaken was finally revealed to the world, and as the elite began to bow to her, the Minyoungs realized with a jolt of terror that the daughter they had discarded was now the only person who held the power to save or destroy them. The glittering lights of the gala fell cold as Mr. Minyoung stormed toward the head table. The shock on his face had quickly curdled into a desperate, ugly mask of entitlement. He didn't care that the most powerful people in the city were watching. He only cared about the wealth he saw slipping through his fingers. He slammed a stack of legal documents onto the table in front of Yena, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the sudden silence of the room. "Enough of this theater, Yena," he bellowed, his voice shaking with a mix of rage and greed. "I don't care what crown you're wearing tonight. I am your father, and by my authority, you will sign these papers. You're going to transfer those syndicate assets and the peace treaty rights to the Min Young name immediately. You owe us for every meal we fed you and every roof we put over your head." Yena looked down at the papers. They were a total surrender of her new life, a way for her father to parasitically feast on the power she had earned. She looked up at him, her eyes steady. "I paid those debts 1,000 times over with my silence and my labor," she said quietly. "I don't owe you anything, especially not my future." Mr. Min Young raised his hand, his face purple with fury. "You ungrateful girl. I brought you into this world, and I can—" Before his hand could move another inch, a shadow fell over the table. Do-Hyun didn't shout. He didn't need to. He stepped forward with a predatory grace, his large frame physically blocking Mr. Min Young's path. He positioned his body firmly between the trembling older man and Yena, a human wall of granite and silk. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Do-Hyun looked down at the man who had spent a lifetime making Yena feel small. "You made a mistake," Do-Hyun said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated in the chests of everyone nearby. "You think you can still command her because of a bloodline you spat on. You think your authority matters in my house." Do-Hyun reached back, taking Yena's hand and bringing it to his chest, making sure the entire room saw the ring that now sparkled on her finger. He turned his gaze back to Mr. Min Young, his eyes burning with a lethal promise. "The woman standing behind me isn't your daughter anymore. You lost that right the moment you left her in the dark. She is my wife. She is a Do-Hyun now. And if you ever raise your voice to her again, I will ensure the world forgets you ever existed." Mr. Min Young's hand dropped to his side. He looked at Do-Hyun's lethal gaze, then at Yena's calm, resolute face behind him. For the first time, the cold rejecter looked truly small. He realized that his power was a shadow, and Yena had finally walked into the sun. She wasn't hiding behind Do-Hyun. She was standing with him, and together they were untouchable. The aftermath of the gala felt like the clearing of a long, suffocating fog. In the quiet of Do-Hyun's private study, a single manila envelope sat on the desk. It contained the results of a private investigation Do-Hyun had commissioned the moment he realized the Min Youngs treated their only child like a disposable stranger. Yena opened the file, her hand steady, while Do-Hyun stood by the window, giving her the space to face the truth. The documents inside were old, yellow birth records and a confession from a retired nurse. Yena's breath hitched as she read the names. She wasn't a Min Young. She had been born to the Choice, a rival family that had been wiped out in a suspicious accident 20 years ago. The Min Youngs hadn't raised her out of love or even obligation. They had stolen her. They needed a puppet heir to claim the massive Choi inheritance and land rights that could only be passed through blood. To them, she wasn't a daughter or even a waitress. She was a stolen bank account. "They didn't just neglect you, Yena," Do-Hyun said, turning to face her. His voice was soft but heavy with the weight of the revelation. "They erased your identity so they could live off your ghost. Every moment of suffering you endured was a calculated move to keep you small, so you would never question who you really were." Yena looked at the photos of her real parents, seeing her own eyes reflected in their smiling faces. A strange sense of peace washed over her. The guilt she had felt for disobeying her parents evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She wasn't a failure to a family. She was a survivor of a crime. That evening, the Min Youngs were summoned one last time. They stood in the foyer of the estate, expecting a payout or a plea for forgiveness. Instead, Yena met them at the top of the grand staircase. She didn't look down at them with anger. She looked at them as if they were nothing more than dust on her shoes. She dropped the DNA results and the old police reports at their feet. "The inheritance is being reclaimed," Yena said, her voice echoing with the power of a woman who finally knew her worth. "The police have the records of the Choi accident. You have 1 hour to leave the city before the warrants are issued. Don't ever use my name again. You never owned it." As the panicked couple scrambled out into the night, stripped of their stolen wealth and their pride, Yena turned to Do-Hyun. He was waiting for her, his hand extended, a silent promise of a future built on truth rather than lies. She took his hand, stepping away from the shadows of the past. She wasn't a waitress, a ghost, or a stolen heir anymore. She was the architect of a new dynasty, the Mafia's greatest treasure, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged.